I'm Susan Purney Mark. I'm a surface design artist and quilter. In this series on mark making on fabric, I'm exploring different ways of creating pattern and texture onto fabric that I can then incorporate into my art. In this episode, we're going to be looking at print rollers. They can be as simple as rolling pins with sticky shapes stuck on. They could be cardboard tubes with different things like elastic bands or string twisted around them. They can be simple sponge rollers that you apply with varying amounts of pressure, and all the way up to more complex designed rollers, especially for printing. Let's look at some of the printing options. So I'd like to show you 3 different ways of putting some marks onto fabric with print rollers. I have my paint on a piece of plexiglass that I've covered with Glad Press and Seal. That allows me to lift it up and throw it into the garbage. When I'm done, it saves washing the plexiglass palette. I have a cardboard tube that I've just covered with elastic bands, and simple. You can find them in your kitchen. And I'm just going to spread the paint out with the brayer. And what I'm going to look at is making the area about as long as my little roller here, so that I'm covering or getting as much coverage as I can when I'm working. And I'll just turn my little palette here and just lightly run the roller through the paint. So I'm not really pushing down too hard, and sometimes you'll get some blobs happening. It's pretty hard to get away from that, but if you put on too much pressure, the elastic bands will just kind of squish down, and you'll get too much paint onto the paper of the roller. And then allowing it to sort of flow towards you. Always try and work when you're printing towards yourself. I can roll it, and as I go, as I'm printing and removing the paint from the elastic bands, I'm actually putting more pressure on the tube so that I can get as much paint there as possible. So you can see those little blobs along there. That's just part of what it does. So in this way we have a really interesting pattern on the fabric. We could leave it as is, or we could go in the other direction. So let's try doing that. We've got a design that really is very effective. We could have left it as lines just going in one direction, but doing it in this way just adds more interest, more detail, and we could do multiple ways of working into it just with those elastic bands on the paper tube. Now in this case, I've got a couple of sponge rollers. These are easy to purchase at the hardware store. This one has elastic bands wrapped around it, and that will give an interesting print by varying the pressure. You almost get a skin-like effect, sort of alligator skin, and you can see that you get some interesting print with that coming down. And I could even go over for a more dense design and create pattern with that. Or I can use a sponge roller like this just as is. So I'm picking up some of the paint and using those same just little flicks, or you could go in a more even tone, and I'm pushing down further because I know the paint is being used up on the roller. And go down another time. And so we're creating some linear patterns. And so I can also go back in there and over, leaving a little gap or not, and just having that pattern happening. Now you may kind of wonder what good is all of these fabrics that I'm making, and I don't use them as fabrics like you see. I tend to go in and cut them up. So these are frames made from just some mat board, and I can isolate areas that are interesting that I think I would use that as part of one of my piecing projects. I could look at something like that, and by isolating certain areas you can see how that might be used in your artwork. This print roller was specifically made for doing mark making on fabric. It's actually a rolling pin that was put on a lathe and areas were carved out. In this case, there's evenly spaced lines across the surface. On our fabric, I have placed some masking tape. So we're going to work a little differently on this fabric in rolling on the design with the print roller and then removing the masking tape to have open areas and then printing back into those. So let's give that a try and see what happens. So there I have the print on the fabric, and I'll take the masking tape off. I'm just going to try and print in those areas that were masked off and come up with a little bit of variation in the design. So I think you can imagine just by looking at this fabric how I could have masked off areas in a whole range of different areas, different sizes. I could have done squares or circles or a variety of different ones, but I think this is a really interesting way of working, that we're working with both the pattern of the lines and the open areas and going in different directions. So I think that will show you some possibilities where you'd like to work in the future. Thanks for joining me on Mark Making on Fabric. I hope you found something interesting in this episode to explore in your fabric art. Remember, you can reach me through my website at susanpm.com or visit me on my blog at susanpm.blogspot.com. Thank you.